How will the price of Bitcoin be affected by the fourth halving? You may have seen a number of very bold predictions claiming the price will rise to hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not over $1 million in the next year or two. Yet they rarely give any reasonable justification for this. In this video, I'm going to use a simple and reasonable model that anyone can follow to predict the price of Bitcoin in the next year. And the way we're going to do this is by looking at past halvings. How is the price affected in the past years following the block reward halving? So far, we've had 3 halvings. The first halving took place in November of 2012. At the time of the halving, Bitcoin was selling for about $12. The following year's high, meaning the high in the year 2013, was about $1,100. Now, what we're going to track here is the gain in the following year after the halving event. So that just means the change in price divided by the original price. So this green P is the high of the following year after the halving event, and then P sub H is the price at the time of the halving. So in this case, H equals 1, since it's the first halving. And then we divide that entire difference by the original price at the halving. Plugging the numbers for the first halving, we get a gain of about 93. The second halving occurred in July of 2016, when Bitcoin was going for about $660. The following year's high, or the 2017 high, was at about $19,000. This gives a gain of about 28. The third halving occurred in May of 2020, when Bitcoin was going for about $8,500. The 2021 high, 1 year later, was at about $67,000 or $68,000, giving a gain of about 7. Now, some of you may be looking at these graphs and noticing that the third halving looks different from the other two, and then further realize that this third halving occurred around the time of the COVID pandemic. And hence you might think the behavior after the third halving was skewed by the pandemic. Well, the pandemic occurred in 2020, and this funny behavior, funny if you think it's abnormal compared to the other two, takes place in 2021 when we're starting to come out of the pandemic. But you may argue there is some time lag for the effects of the pandemic to show up in the price of Bitcoin, and that's why it's coming up about a year later. And maybe you're right about that. However, we're comparing this third halving to only 2 other halvings. 2 data points is not enough to justify abnormal or normal behavior. So in this model, I'm not going to make any special considerations due to the pandemic. Instead, what we're going to assume is that the price of Bitcoin in the year following the halving event is dominated by the effects of the halving of the block reward, and any other effects are secondary, including the pandemic. We want to now predict what the gain is going to be for the fourth halving, given the behavior for the past 3 halvings. This would be a good moment to hit those like and subscribe buttons if you haven't done so already. Immediately, you probably notice that the gain has decreased with each subsequent halving. We can plot the gain versus the halving event. So on the vertical axis, I have the gain, and on the horizontal axis, I have the halving event. H just being the number of the halving event, so 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. And we can see we have a clear decreasing plot. So now we want to try to model the shape of this curve to figure out how it's going to look in the future. The first and most obvious shape you might try is just a straight line. And that seems reasonable enough, except that you'll notice that after the third halving, the gain is going to go negative, meaning that for the fourth halving, this would predict that the price of Bitcoin goes down. This doesn't really make sense because reducing the block reward increases the scarcity of Bitcoin, and the more scarce Bitcoin is, or any other resource, the higher the price should be. So this doesn't really behave the way we would expect. So what kind of behavior do we expect? Well, let's imagine what would happen after a very large number of halvings, like infinite halvings. Now, Bitcoin is not going to go on halving for an infinite amount of times, but let's just pretend it does for the sake of argument to see what should we expect after a long time. If you went out really far on this graph, like say 60 halving events, at that point the block reward would be something like a billionth of a Satoshi. And cutting in half a billionth of a Satoshi is really going to have 0 effect on the availability of Bitcoin, considering by then 99.9999999% of all Bitcoin would have already been mined. So we would expect that after a very large number of halvings, another halving would have no effect whatsoever. So in other words, the gain should be 0. So we're looking for a curve that decreases but approaches 0 as you go to a very large number of halvings, as you go out to infinite halvings. some sort of curve that asymptotically approaches zero but never actually crosses it. Well, the most obvious candidate for such a curve is an exponential decay. There are other curves that follow this behavior, like a 1 over h to some exponent, but an exponential decay is probably more reasonable. So let's try fitting that. Maybe another video I'll try a 1 over x to the n type function. So now that we have an idea of the curve we're looking at, we want to know what is this going to be when h equals 4 at the fourth halving. In order to do that, you can see in this function we have two parameters, a and alpha, that we need to figure out. What we want to do is match a and alpha to the curve that best fits these past three data points. The way we're going to do this is using what's called a least squares fit. For those of you who know what a least squares fit is, you might be thinking, but least squares fit are used for linear functions, and this is an exponential function. Well, we can turn an exponential into a linear function by taking its natural log. So I'm going to define a new function, f of h being the halving event, equal to the log of the gain, natural log of the gain. And when you do that, the properties of a log give us this function here, the log of a, which is a constant, minus alpha times h, where h is our variable. So this is now a linear function. So we can do a least squares fit. The idea in a least squares fit is that we're trying to minimize the difference between our function and the actual data points. And specifically, we're trying to minimize the difference squared, because we only care how far off we are, not in what direction. If we're too low or too high is not important, we just want to be as close as possible. So I'm going to define this function, the log of g of h. This is the log of the data points minus f of h, which is our model, and we're going to square it. I'm going to call this whole thing delta, and we want to minimize the expected value of this function. I'm not going to explain how to do this. It's a fairly standard procedure. If you don't know it, it doesn't matter. And when you run through this minimizing procedure, you'll find that the optimal a and alpha are 351 and 1.295 respectively. Now we fully know our best fit for our gain function. All we got to do is plug in h equals 4 for the halving event to find that we get a gain of 2. So now that we have a gain of 2, what we're really looking for is the high the year after the fourth halving. So we want the high for the year 2025, which will correspond to this green p here in our definition of the gain, given that p sub h is p sub 4. So we can simply rearrange this to solve for this green p to get that the 2025 high should be the price at the fourth halving times 1 plus the gain. The gain is 2, so 1 plus the gain is 3. So the expected 2025 high should be 3 times the price at the fourth halving. Currently, Bitcoin is sitting at around $70,000, so 3 times $70,000 gives us $210,000. Now, maybe the price will change dramatically between now and the fourth halving, so we can revisit this formula at that time. But for now, assuming the price doesn't change too much, we expect about $210K for the 2025 high. The expected error in our prediction works out to being about $6,000. This is not strictly mathematically rigorous, but good enough for government work. Roughly speaking, we have about a 95% chance of being within 2 deviations of our expected value. So with about 95% confidence, we expect that the 2025 high will be within $197,000 to $223,000. So this is nowhere near the $1 million mark as some have claimed, but it's still a nice gain, not as good as previous halving events, but I challenge you to find a better investment. The one caveat I will make is that there is something new this year that was not present in the last halving events, and that's the introduction of the Bitcoin ETFs, which have been around for about 2 months or so. Given that these were just introduced, it's not known how this will affect the price of Bitcoin, but I would expect it would give it a boost. How much of a boost? Nobody knows. So the great thing about my model here is that if I'm wrong, I can just chalk it up to the effects of the Bitcoin ETF. Unless, of course, the price is lower than I predicted, in which case I'll have no choice but to admit this model doesn't work. Or at best, I could rationalize that 3 data points wasn't enough to make an accurate prediction. Let me know what you think of this model in the comments, and if you enjoyed this video, be sure to like and subscribe and hit the bell to be notified for future videos.